Hello, everyone. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the Strategic Insight session organized by the Tillotoma Foundation, which is on the theme of fundamentals of the air power strategy. Tillotoma Foundation is a global think tank working in the areas of international relations, diplomacy, area studies, gender, environmental, financial, scientific, strategic, and defense policy. I am Kamakshi Wason, Global Chief Operating Officer and Director of Academic Programs at the Tillotoma Foundation. Let me also thank Mr. Soham Das, Chairperson and Director at the Tillotoma Foundation, for his constant support and encouragement in curating this session. We at the Tillotoma Foundation are committed to enhancing knowledge, promoting critical thinking, and fostering the exchange of ideas through various academic programs and research initiatives. We put a lot of emphasis on inclusivity, gender equality, and being impartial in our approach. Defense policy and military studies have been important focus areas of the Foundation. We have been conducting the series titled Strategic Insight Sessions for a few years now. This Strategic Insight session is on the fundamentals of air power strategy, as well as the various dimensions of the usage of air power in both historical and contemporary wars. Air power has emerged as a crucial aspect of modern warfare and statecraft. It plays a significant role in shaping international relations, peacetime operations, and even during times of conflict. As the world becomes more interconnected and technology continues to advance, the significance of accurately understanding and effectively employing air power for strategic and tactical purposes cannot be overstated. Over time, different wars, for example, World War II, the Gulf War, and the NATO intervention in Kosovo, have demonstrated the immense political utility for air power, particularly precision-guided air power for the later ones. By affording presence effect and speed of response without complete commitment or excessive vulnerability, air power has proven to be a dominant force in military operations. In the era of virtual war and precision weaponry, air power has become overwhelmingly attractive in deploying medium and small scale forces. With the ability to dominate the sky and space, air power has revolutionized the way wars are fought. It may be argued that in the air power era, neither armies nor navies can be considered the sole primary instrument of securing victory in war. There are a few important questions which come to mind, which may be discussed at length later during the session, such as, how can air power be effectively integrated into overall military strategy? What are the challenges and limitations of relying solely on air power in warfare? How can air power be leveraged to achieve strategic objectives in a manner that minimizes collateral damages and maximizes precision? How can air power be effectively utilized to maintain superiority in the face of evolving technological advancements and changing global dynamics? What role does air power play in shaping international relations and promoting peace during peacetime operations? I'm sure as noted speaker for today will address these questions and shed light on the fundamentals of the air power strategy, as well as the various dimensions of the usage of air power in both historical and contemporary wars. I'm pleased to welcome our special speaker for today, Dr. Heather P. Venable. She's an associate professor of military and security studies, as well as the course director for air power strategy and operations in the US Air Force Air Command and Staff College. She has authored a very interesting book, How the Few Became the Proud, Crafting the Marine Corps Mystique, 1874-1918, Transforming War. Additionally, Dr. Venable has extensive expertise in military history and has researched the role of air power in shaping warfare. Thank you so much, Heather, for being here at the Tillotoma Foundation and sharing your insights on this topic. I would now like to request Dr. Venable to start with her talk. Over to you, Dr. Venable.
Good morning, or I should say good evening, everyone. It's good morning here, but good evening to all of you, and thank you for joining. Get into talking about airplanes. My talk today is entitled Continuity and Change in Air Power History. And we see two pictures, one a balloon, and then on the right hand, we see on your right hand, you're going to see some small drones. So I just want you to take a moment. I'm just going to not talk for about 15 seconds. And I want you to think about what might be some of the similarities and differences between these two pictures. So I'm going to give you some background context on this first picture. This air balloon that you see in the top right corner is the first use of an airborne asset to do reconnaissance in the sky. And this goes all the way back to the Battle of Fleurus in 1794. So in many ways, we think of air power being a revolutionary capability that really emerged in World War I. However, it has a much longer history. And I think it goes to the theme that sometimes we get caught up in how much technology is revolutionary, but also it tends actually to be more evolutionary. And so that will be a theme throughout my talk. Also, we can see that if we think about the ideas that underpin air power employment, instead of the tools that are used, there is also a lot of continuity in air power history. So, for example, looking at the core missions of today's US Air Force, they are air and space superiority, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or ISR for short, global strike, air mobility, and command and control. And I've put in red the new things that really have emerged in those core missions as we've gone through the last 100 years. But air superiority is something that, the first air forces over the Western Front were trying to achieve. Space superiority is obviously new because we couldn't reach space until far more recently. As we've already seen, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance has been going on since 1794 from the air. And strike is, the idea of just hitting something with a bomb is as old as World War I. And air mobility as well was even used in World War I when these DH-4 bombers that you can see were used to drop supplies to the US Army's lost battalion and help them keep going. And finally, command and control is essential to air power, particularly because air power tends to be a sort of high value asset. There's usually not as much of it as you would like to go around. And so command and control consists of how do you organize and bring your airplanes to the fight most efficiently and then control it during operations. So again, the point is that I'm looking at continuity and change in air power history. And as we can see with the core missions of what an Air Force tends to do, much of those ideas and ways of employment are still have far greater continuity than change. And so my argument today that I will say a million times is, again, if we think about the ideas that underpin air power, we can see far more continuity than change than if we look at the tools, which of course have changed greatly over the years. And there's in some ways kind of a war between two different schools of thought in thinking about future warfare. And I've labeled this slide two competing truths because it is I think hard to argue that both of these schools of thought have much that they are correct about. It's just that they tend to overstate their cases. And so one is the future technologists. They tend to stress that everything that comes on the battlefield is highly disruptive, very revolutionary, and is going to be some kind of game-changing weapon. The traditionalists, which tend to be nerdy historians like myself, tend to say, well, actually, there's nothing new under the sun, and we tend to think about how tools are employed and the concepts underlying them rather than the tools themselves. And so, for example, if you saw about a year ago or so, the first two drones dogfighting, the future technologists would stress that it's the two drones that are dogfighting, where the traditionalists would be like, this is nothing new. We've been dogfighting for more than 100 years. So calm down, hold the phone, as we say in America. Here we can see a kind of a future technologist view. You will see this in a lot of the mainstream commentary on the Russo-Ukraine war. I'm not going to play the clip, but in this case, a retired Air Force colonel is referring to UAVs, and he's explaining how this has, quote, revolutionized warfare. However, a more traditionalist view is that instead of looking at technologies as game changers, we tend to stress the never-ending cycle of adaptation. And so where the future technologists seem to, kind of hope for a silver bullet that's going to win the war and be a game changer, once we put these new technologies into Ukraine, then we see Russia adapting. So we have an example here. People were expecting HIMARS to be a game changer, but Russia adapted it. So what do we have to do? Well, then we had to give them a different type of weapon that hopefully would make a huge decisive difference. And then on the right, we have then the storm shadow. Now the storm shadows are there, but still Russia is already learning to adapt. So again, the point is that the traditionalists tend to stress you can introduce a new weapon, but because warfare is highly adaptive, because the stakes are high, your opponent is going to adapt, and that's going to lead to the never-ending learning cycle that tends to be war. I want to talk a little bit about some of the tools of the air war so that we're all on the same page. They're going to be the SUASs, which are the small unmanned aerial systems. Those are those quadcopters that you can buy off of Amazon or your local electronics store and fly around yourself. Then there are the loitering munitions, which are one-way small missiles that are designed to loiter and be able to be retargeted in flight. And those have gotten a lot of press, especially the US Switchblade and then the Iranian Shahed 136. UAVs, we've been familiar with those throughout the global war on terror. They tend to be a lot larger. Of course, tons of ballistic and cruise missiles flying over Ukraine every night out of Russia. Ground-based air defense has been hugely important in this war and led to a lot of talk on not just air superiority, but air denial. Helicopters are still fighting at the front, even though they are quite vulnerable to many different types of weapons. And then we've seen, in terms of airplanes, we tend to see fighters in terms of air superiority and ground attack, some airborne command and control, Russian tankers, and then Russian bombers. Some ways to sort of think about how do we categorize all of this variety of air power that we are seeing. We can think about the cheap massed air power versus the exquisite. So here we have a picture of a quadcopter. As I said, that's something pretty affordable that that you could buy if you want, if you're a hobbyist. Here we have the Shahed 136, and then over here we have a MiG-31 with a Kinzhal hypersonic weapon. And so the UASs are these cheap SUASs. Ukraine is losing like 10,000 of these a month, which shows you how expendable they are. Where I've seen numbers for the Shahed 136, which is still relatively cheap at about $20,000 to $40,000, maybe 2,000 a year being used to, I'm not sure exactly how many of the Kinzhals have been used, but I'm guessing it's around 10 to 20. Another way to try to organize different buckets of air power to get a handle on all of this complexity is stand in versus stand off. So, you know, your helicopters are probably going to be some of the closer to the fight, as well as, of course, the smaller UASs and SUASs. You're going to have the fighters probably further off. And then again, a lot of missiles are being launched over Russian territory into Ukraine. And then one of the probably the most interesting developments that we're seeing is a lot of this small air power is becoming kind of self-supporting, in which ground power is now getting its own individual or, you know, small unit air power that before that has been more centralized and has been sort of released to support them as required. And you still have your traditional supporting helicopters and fighters. And then you also have independent air power in support of the larger joint fight. And that's what you see with a lot of the missile attacks against Ukraine. So that was about talking about some of the tools of war, but now going back to ideas, which are of course underlying these tools. One way we can look at this war is as a game of hide and seek, one of the oldest kids games in the books. And so what's happening here with drones is they're not really revolutionizing the war. All they're doing is, very importantly, enabling ground maneuvers. So they're giving people more situational awareness of what's going on. They're allowing better and faster targeting. They're speeding up war, but it's still the basic idea of trying to hide from your opponent and at the same time find your opponent. And so people like Stephen Biddle and some more recent research have said that drones are not revolutionizing war. They're just adding another tool and adding another layer of complexity. So here are some of the big themes that I see occurring. What is new, what is different? I mean, definitely war is changing. It's becoming faster. It's more complex as we have all these different types of air power, from sort of small, cheap air power to more expensive and traditional air power. And of course, because of reliance on space and cyber, air power is more interdependent on other domains, and that's a whole extra load of complexity in planning and operating. But on the flip side, all of this has been going on for decades. Now, if we're talking about the changing nature of war, there is the potential that artificial intelligence will change the nature of war, because if we define the nature of war as sort of humans using tools for political purposes, if we introduce non-human ways of thinking, that may in fact change the nature of war. But that, of course, remains to be seen. As I've already said, air superiority is becoming it's always been multi-domain in that the land and the ground, the land and the air reinforce each other in being able to achieve it and defend the air. But now, again, there's more reliance on space and cyber to even enable air power. And then there's the increasing overlap between ground and air delivered effects. And so you see the democratization of air power, both spreading horizontally through countries, but also vertically, as I've already said, where soldiers in many ways now have their own air power that they can use at a tactical level to help them. What will stay the same? Clausewitz tells us about the importance of luck, fog, and friction, and those will continue to be huge factors in shaping the battlefield. If we had just looked at the relative tools of Russia versus Ukraine, we would have all predicted that Ukraine would be Russian today. But the fact that it's not just the tools, this conflict very much demonstrates it's a whole host of other things, many things that are very intangible. Another, I've already said this theme, but you can't really say it enough. Adaptation is followed by counter-adaptation, which is then followed by more adaptation. And so we can see this, for example, in the US coalition effort against ISIS, where ISIS was using very inexpensive, cheap drones, and they had some effect. But then this has since been followed by an explosion of counter UAS technology, and that continues to develop and develop today. We see that with Ukraine was able to make a very effective use of TB2s for a few days, but then Russia adapted. And we've already seen the examples of some of the adaptation with the Storm Shadows and HIMARS. And then the sort of ongoing question with air power is this offensive defensive cycle. The offensive is cheaper and it can overwhelm defenses. Russia has not been able to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses yet. But stepping back from that conflict and looking at it long term, what will be who will have the continuing edge in offense versus defense as we continue to develop these weapons based on a lot of the employment that they've gotten in the last 18 months in Ukraine. Okay, so now I'm going to talk briefly about the 5 core missions in Ukraine. And so talking about air and space superiority, this has been huge. Arguably the most important, well, I don't know. There are a handful of most important factors that have kept Ukraine in the fight, but this is arguably one of the sort of top 5 I would suggest in terms of the survival of Ukraine's mobile air defenses in March 2022 kept it in the fight. And then NATO's ability to reinforce those capabilities for ground-based air defense has been huge in keeping Ukraine in the fight. In Russia's favor, however, they do have more localized air superiority over the battlefield. So here you can see Crimea, where they have some S-400 and the range of which they are able to hit. And so this gives them an advantage over Ukrainian air defenses, which, first of all, Ukraine doesn't have S-400s. They only have S-300s and other technology. But a lot of that technology is pulled back to protect Kyiv because this air defense is too critical to lose. So Russia does have an advantage with localized air superiority over the battlefield. And it also does have an advantage in missiles in terms of numbers. Again, it has not overwhelmed Ukraine's defenses, and there are different arguments about whether Russia will or will not run out of missiles. Right now, it seems like they are able to make 0.82 of a new cruise missile every day, and they've opened a factory for the Shahed 136, and so they are able to keep going and keep targeting. Just to zoom a little bit more into the state of current operations in Ukraine right now, this red area you can see is controlled by Russia. And what Ukraine is trying to do right now with its summer offensive is to pierce through to get to the Sea of Azov. And this would separate Russian troops, break them up in two, and it would also break this land bridge that is able to supply Crimea, especially if they can get the Kursk bridge, which is why that has been an increasing focus. You can see in the last week or so, Robatnya has been hugely in the news. And you can see here with this inlet why they want to get to Melitopol so they can try to stop this road and then stop these roads over into Crimea. And that would be a huge advance in trying to sort of starve off Crimea and really be a enormous operational advantage for Ukraine. And you can see, thanks to helpful Google Maps, if we went to Robatnya today, which none of us would probably want to do, we could walk to Melitopol in 19 hours and 21 minutes. So it's not that far technically, but of course, the Ukrainians are facing enormous Russian fortifications right now. So it's an immense challenge. Okay, so air superiority or air denial has been hugely important, especially for keeping the Ukrainians in the fight. Let's talk a little bit about the second core mission of Airpower. It's technically for the Air Force Global Strike, but most nations don't have global strike capabilities, but they do have long-range strike, and this is becoming more and more the case for many nations around the world. So let's talk about the missile war. The missile war began, of course, in the late winter of 2022, and at first Russia emphasized attacking air bases, defenses, munition depots, traditional military targets, high-value military targets. And then kind of changed its focus on targeting April 2022 to interdict supplies, especially weapons deliveries from NATO, by going after rail and bridges, but also oil. If you have a highly mechanized military, then you need oil to fight. Then they have moved somewhat more towards in the last summer to a focus on punishing civilians by targets on hospitals, apartment buildings, things that we've all seen already from them in Syria. And then in fall 2022, they really went after electricity in particular and hoped to pummel Ukraine into submission by destroying their electricity. They did destroy about 30% of the power grid. I haven't dug in deeply enough to sort of know what type of electricity targets they were hitting, how accurate those strikes were, and how sort of quickly that electricity can be repaired, because there's some things that are a lot harder to repair than others. And then just to give you a sense of a sort of a daily missile load from Russia in terms of how the missile war is going, of course, there's going to be subject to ebbs and flows, but 2 days ago, September 5th, 2023, two bombers launched 7 missiles. I think it was 2 bombers, 1 ballistic missile, so an Iskander, and then 25 Shahed 136. So that's a nighttime attack on Ukraine. And really, in terms of thinking at the strategic level, this is very, very typical, this development that we've seen from February through fall of different sort of target sets of, air power tends to have more bombs than there are targets. This is actually not the case for Ukraine. It was an allied force because it's a very small country. There was a lot of restrictions put on the targeting, but in Ukraine, there are a lot of things to target. And the Russia is really just shifting its target sets in hopes of finding something that works. Excuse me, allergies season around here. Okay, so we've seen, I talked about sort of the cheap attritable weapons and also the expensive weapons. And one of the things that Russia is doing to employ them is to use both of them together to provide more targeting challenges and also better overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses, because air defense is very expensive. And so we have the Shahed 136, and I've put up the picture of the World War I Camel because they fly at similar speeds. The Shahed looks kind of fancy, I guess, but it's really sort of like plywood and paper, and it's very, very low tech with very cheap off-the-shelf GPS and INS technology that allows it to be pretty affordable. They're about $20,000 to $40,000, where a cruise missile is going to be 1 million plus. And so what Russia is doing is using a combination of cheap weapons with more expensive cruise and ballistic missiles that are more effective at destroying things, but you still want to take down those Shahed 136s because, as Clausewitz told us, it's never just about the military and the government, it's also about the people. And it's important to protect Ukrainian people for any number of practical reasons, as well as human rights, as well as the narrative that Ukraine is disseminating about the individual worth of humans, and Russia's very different approach to that. And so the Shahed 136 doesn't necessarily need to blow up buildings or necessarily, strike precision targets, but that's kind of irrelevant. Its military effectiveness is actually that it is helping run down Ukrainian air defenses. Here, just a brief slide just to kind of give you a picture of how Russia is prioritizing. You can see the Shahed 136 is about almost 60% of its Russian missile attacks, and that's actually gone up from earlier in the summer. And you can see the air-launched cruise missiles are now only about a fourth. So you could say that maybe Russia is hurting in its missile arsenal, but that is certainly up to debate. One piece of evidence that may suggest that it is up to that they are hurting to some extent. You saw a attack against a shopping mall by a KH-22 anti-ship missile, and what happened is they were actually supposedly aiming at a military target, but the anti-ship missile is obviously designed to hit a ship, which tends to be a large gray object in water. And so the missile went, instead of the target it was supposed to go, it got distracted by this shiny, glitzy shopping mall and hit it instead. And so some of what we see of that seems to be Russian, there is definitely deliberate targeting of civilians, but some of it is also because they are using weapons that really aren't always designed for the purpose in some of these cases. Bombing to Win is one of those important books in air power history. And really, when we're talking about the idea of civilian attacks on civilians, there's been this hope for air power employers, for some air power employers for decades, that if we could just make bombing so painful for civilians that they would, flock to their government and say, let's give up, let's give up, let's give up. Robert Pape and others have actually argued that punishment attacks versus civilians do not work very well. First of all, in authoritarian states, authoritarian governments are able to sort of clamp down on that and prevent the people from rising. And in more democratic states, we also does not seem to work very well because it really just makes people angry instead of fearful. And so, to some extent, some of the atrocities that Russia has committed, both against in its occupied areas and against Ukrainian cities, has been a huge morale boost to Ukraine, even though it is very wearing and exhausting on them. I think also this chart is interesting because it kind of puts into perspective where most of the missile strikes were going. Now, this is a bit dated. I haven't seen a more recent one. This is back in a year ago. But here's Kyiv, and you can see 34 missile strikes. There's some military targets here that the commentators have found interesting that Russia, really hasn't gone after in terms of air bases. And then over where most of the battlefield action is occurring, that's where most of the missile strikes are going, which suggests that most of the missile war is actually aimed at supporting the battlefield fight, more so than this kind of large-scale punishment attack against Ukrainian citizens, although that is certainly part and parcel of what is going on. So I would argue that the ongoing missile war is as much an air superiority campaign as it is a strategic air campaign, in that Russia wants to wear down Ukrainian missile defenses because those are so important to keeping Ukraine in the fight. And there's a question of, could the Russians have waged this missile war more effectively, especially in a more overwhelming way that would have helped them. So there are many desired strategic effects in terms of waging this kind of either missile or long range air war, whether it's decapitation and hoping to change leadership, whether it's breaking leadership or civilian population's will to fight, which usually does not work as they would like. The key military targets, like there was recently a missile strike against an airbase in far western Ukraine, and that was almost more of a psychological or sort of a narrative bombing, I would say, in that they were trying to strike pilots that were about to go be trained in the West to fly the F-16. Electricity, if you can, modern societies, that is an important target. But ultimately, I think the most important thing here is how can Russia run Ukraine out of air defense missiles. Ukrainian long-range strike capabilities are much, much weaker. But here you can see where, UASs have targeted Moscow. They're not doing much damage as of yet. You can also see here a lot of areas, probably sort of military strikes, but also ones designed maybe to invoke fear and change Russian popular support for the war. And then importantly, a lot of action going on in Crimea. And, with the new Ministry of Defense appointment this week with a Crimean, that's going to probably, a lot more is going to be occurring probably there than the West may or may not like. But we can see there've been small swarms, some deception. Ukraine is trying to build up its own long-range strike capabilities, and it's just a long process. I want to step back and put the air war in perspective because Russia has not used massed air power like we would necessarily expect, even though it seems like a lot. So no, there are a lot of words on here. I'm going to be quiet for like 30 seconds or so and kind of let you read through them and then just briefly talk to all the words. So some big things that we see here. The first 3 days of the Russo-Ukraine war, huge invasion of another country, 250 cruise and ballistic missiles launched. By contrast, in the first 3 days of Operation Desert Fox, the U.S. launched 420 cruise missiles. Operation Desert Fox was a sort of against Iraq in 1998. The point was to attack Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction and also sort of punish him as well, say, hey, stop what you're doing. And the fact that we used 420 cruise missiles shows the overwhelming approach to force as opposed to the Russo-Ukraine war. So in those first 3 days. So it's not, maybe that's Russian overconfidence. We're not really sure, but we can also see in terms of just mass of precision weapons in the first 10 days of Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, the US used, or the coalition used 10,000 PGMs. And the first 10 days of the Russo-Ukraine war, there were 1,000. So the scale of air power being employed is much smaller. And then again, you can see in terms of mass against individual targets, early on in the war, Russia struck two air bases with about 8 cruise missiles each. So 16 cruise missiles was 2 bombers worth of a load, where when the US attacked Syria for using chemical weapons, they hit 1 air base with 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles. And so while it can seem like the Russian scale of war is huge, it's interesting to put it into perspective to help us maybe think about numbers a little bit differently. Okay, so now I'm going to move into my third core mission of air power, which is ISR, or intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Pre-war, Russia mapped out the Ukrainians moved them, and so Russia's great weakness here is that their ISR is not responsive enough, and they may get the information, but then it doesn't get passed through command and control where it needs to go, and then get updated. And so a lot of times they'll end up redundantly targeting things, hitting things where the targets are no longer there because their ISR is just not responsive enough. Meanwhile, we can see that the Ukrainians are benefiting more from open source intelligence, or OSINT, and we can see the democratization of ISR, the value that allies and partners can bring in sharing that the information that they may have from more exquisite capabilities, especially space ones. But then also, again, we're still seeing that democratization of space power, where you can buy a lot of ISR now that used to be really only the most powerful nations had access to. Air mobility is not so much a factor in this war, although it is hugely important in enabling sort of the U.S. way of its ability to project power around the globe. Theoretically, it's huge, especially in counterinsurgencies, for its ability to move ground troops around quickly, move supplies. And then right now we do see some prioritization of refueling bombers, which limits Russian fighters' ability to provide combat air patrols over and off sort of the battlefield. And then in the Western mind, I think that NATO and the US tend to see command and control as the operational center of gravity of modern warfare, and in many ways the most important thing to target. And I think China also has adopted that idea as well. And really the command and control for air power, again, is, as I've already said, is how do you take a small number asset, especially when you're talking about the exquisite fighters and bombers, and how do you employ it from dispersed bases in a very efficient way so that you can get the most mass. Again, mass is so important, and that's what we have not seen Russia really able to bring to bear in a way that can get at the advantages that it is seeking. Again, Russian C2, they do not have the same kind of sophisticated C2 to do NATO-like combined air operations, where you're bringing together a vast number of different types of aircraft to launch strike packages, so to do electronic warfare and attack and suppression of enemy air defenses, all of these different things. The kill chain is not fast enough to keep up with ground-based air defense movement. And without air superiority, Russia can't use its airborne C2 as much as it can, and so that's not able to shape the air war. And then this is somewhat less important for Ukraine, because the greatest asymmetric advantage, arguably, that Ukraine or that Russia has in this fight is that it has far better traditional airplane air power, as I call it, and then missile air power. There's been a lot of discussion of how much difference the F-16s will make for an outclassed and outnumbered Ukrainian Air Force. I am pessimistic on how much it will make a difference, but I hope it will make a difference. And if the Ukrainians want them, then go ahead and give them to them. They've certainly shown their ability to adapt and be very, very creative. So why not give them these tools? And so one expert says that, Russian pilots have been cautious already, so go ahead and give them F-16s, and they're going to be even more cautious, and that may push them farther off the battlefield, which would be great. So that may be something that is worth using them for. The other thing that they could be very useful for is because of the curvature of the Earth, ground-based air defense can't see as far as airplanes in the sky. Therefore, they also may be a tool that, again, Ukraine can use to supplement its ground-based air defense and prevent it from running out of missiles. And some of these missiles, I think the AIM-120, you can use in these F-16s, but you can also use them in your NASAMS for your ground-based air defense as well. So there's some pluses and minuses. Arguably, the Su-30 and 35, which are sort of their main air superiority fighters, have more modern radar than these planes. They may have better standoff air-to-air missiles than these planes. But again, the Ukrainians are creative, and let's see what they can do with them. However, air power is never just airplanes. And so it's going to have to be used carefully in a dispersed fashion. These F-16s have really sort of fragile landing gear, and so that may require better quality runways, which of course will be a prime target for the Russians. And then air power, as I've already kind of alluded to, isn't just the airplanes. You need the sensors, you need the better weapons, you need the enablers like training, which they will be getting a quick course in. And so it remains to be seen how much of a game changer they will be. again, it's sort of going back to the opening of this talk. A lot of times we expect things to be game changers and they just throw a wrench in the wheel for a short while, and then the Russians adapt. But we will see, and I'm excited to see what will happen there. What if, to do a counterfactual, what does the air war look like if Russia did have more air superiority? It would be a mess for Ukraine. It would be devastating. Think of the pictures of Syria that we've seen, unguided weapons destroying Ukrainian cities, more ability to target Western weapons that are resupplying Ukraine. And then they'd also be able to do a lot of more effective battlefield support, because right now a lot of their battlefield support is a little bit standoff because of Ukrainian SHORAD. So if Russia got, broad air superiority, that would be a nightmare for Ukraine. What would more air superiority look like for Ukraine? They would be able to do more support to the ground offensive. It would help even the playing field in terms of the huge disadvantage at which Ukraine is currently fighting from in terms of air and missile capabilities, and it would be able to enable Ukraine to up the ante on Russian homeland attacks. But again, punishment works both ways. Just because Ukraine strikes targets, that doesn't mean that Russian support is automatically going to go down for the war. It could just as much intensify, because now Ukraine is kind of playing by the same book. I don't think they would ever play to the same extent as the Russian book, but they could up the ante and do more retaliatory strikes. So what do we do with this in the big sort of sweep of lessons regarding change and continuity? Missile defense has been hugely effective in this war, but it can be overwhelmed. And so we have to be looking for the continual back and forth between the offensive and defensive cycle. Air superiority is not necessarily essential for victory, as the US learned quite painfully in the Vietnam War, but it can be an enormous enabler, and air denial is just as important. And then the enemy will, of course, continue to get a vote and may respond in unpredictable ways. A lot of people in the West made fun of Russia early on, and some of that was justified, but they have showed themselves to be a learning organization like any other opponent. And so anything that you do, the enemy always gets a vote and can respond. So, for example, there is a big here in the US was the news of the Replicator program, which is supposed to be a gazillion drones that we would possibly use in a conflict in the Pacific. And when you announce those huge kind of programs, then the enemy or the potential opponent has the same opportunity to respond and start their own similar program. And this can often lead to sort of arms races. So the enemy always gets a vote and gets to respond to what you decide that you want to do. How much is Ukraine a cautionary tale for thinking about future warfare? What can we learn from the kind of conflict that we see? I think that this quote is interesting, but I don't think that I necessarily agree with it, but I would think that maybe this is something that we could talk about in Q&A. This author says, fighter tanks, fighter jets, and warships are being pushed into obsolescence, giving way to new tools of conflict. We may be witnessing in Ukraine the final war of 20th century militaries. And I've put in red tools, because one of the themes that I've tried to stress here is that if we think about the tools, we see everything is changing. If we think of the ideas, they're not necessarily changing. And just this week, with some of the tank warfare that we've seen, Russian tanks are seemingly being pushed into obsolescence, but that's probably because they have not been built as well. They don't protect their people as well. They don't have some of the same exquisite protection built into it that some of the Western tanks do. And so when we think about tanks, we have to think, for example, about, which tanks are we talking about? And are there ways that they can be used to have more effect? And so are we witnessing the final war of 20th century militaries? Boring historian, we just tend to see a lot of similarity in wars. Final slide, stepping out, big picture, talk about air strategy in general and in the Russo-Ukraine war. I've probably talked about, this is going to be a summary, but as I've said a couple of times already, Russia's biggest asymmetric advantage is its airplane air power and its missile air power, and it completely outclasses and outnumbers Ukrainian air power. F-16s will, plug that in a tiny way. Air strategy tends to devolve into targeting. So what should we try to hit next in order to win the war? Russia's air strategy could be characterized as how do we attrit Ukrainian missile defenses to finally get air superiority, which would be a huge game changer for them. And this forces Ukraine to make tough choices regarding air defense. Are we going to put our air defense up at the front, or are we going to pull it back and protect our civilians? And this is also a question of morale. It's not just soldiers versus civilians. Those soldiers have families back in those cities. So it's not easy. And then we see specific target sets pop up in the context of the war. So this summer, it's been sort of grain silos in Odessa and others that have been an important strategic target for Russia. Ukraine's air strategy is really been to just try to have a fighting chance in the air war and to support the ground offensive with more traditional air power than they've currently been able to do. We'll see how well they will be able to do that if they choose that route. It will also maybe be an additional component to add more layers to their air defense. And then also they're increasingly trying to figure out uncrewed or unmanned ways to impose cost on the Russian homeland and to reach longer into especially Crimea as a way to cut that off from the rest of Russian occupied territories. And the future of air warfare will continue to see adoption of traditional air power and sort of new and emerging air power in creative ways. And we have to always be looking for sort of the relative swings between offense and defense. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Heather, for that very interesting and insightful talk. Thank you for highlighting today's theme, fundamentals of air power strategy, in a very beautiful way. So the aspect which you have highlighted in your speech provided us with very much valuable insights into the challenges and opportunities that air power has offered. Let's take some questions to make this more interesting. As you mentioned about the ISR in your talk, so how have US Air Force assets and capabilities such as airlift operations and intelligence, ISR, surveillance and reconnaissance platforms supported Ukrainian forces and contributed to regional stability during the Russia-Ukraine war?
A lot of intelligence sharing between US Air Force Europe and Ukraine. A lot of sort of constant flights by NATO air power outside of the borders of Ukraine. I read a very frustrated Ukrainian general who said, there's more air power just over our borders instead of in our borders. And we want that air power in our borders and not over there. And so just sort of, Ukraine does not necessarily have modern long-range ISR, and that's what US and NATO is able to supplement in important ways.
Thank you so much, Heather. Next question. Considering the implications of the Russia-Ukraine war, as you highlighted about the war so much in your presentation, so in terms of global security, how has this conflict influenced the US Air Force approach to strategic planning, force posture, and also the regional partnerships in Eastern Europe?
I think that the war has reinforced what we were already preparing for. More dispersed conflict, knowing how fast war is and how hard it is to survive. And I think that is a trend that each branch of the US military was well aware of before this conflict kicked off. And then I think also the logistics piece has been hugely important in a kind of a wake-up call to both the US and NATO in terms of needing to rearm its arsenals, hopefully not to use, but if nothing else, for deterrence purposes. I think allies and partners is essential to the US because we don't want to go it alone in any sort of conflict. It's said that the US never wants to fight without partners. I will admit that the US can be too arrogant and know-it-all sometimes in the way I think it sometimes ends up working, but that is not the intent of it. But that is one of the advantages of the West, is that we are trying to be people that have shared values, but also shared interests, where Russia, North Korea, Iran are more about shared interests and not shared values. And so hopefully it is, I think that's the values that we are supporting in Ukraine is, near and dear to my heart.
Thank you so much, Dr. Venable. Next question. How much of an advantage do you think can air power offer in addressing a nuclear armed rogue nation?
I think that depends on the nuclear rogue nation, because military force only works as um, as an opponent lets it work, because ultimately war is not about having the physical effects, it's about having physical effects or having psychological effects to convince someone either that they should stop fighting for their, or stop doing something for their own behavior, or to make them incapable of doing something. And so it depends on the end user and how that user receives either the kinetic effect or the psychological effect. Humans are unpredictable, and that's why coercion is so difficult. I also like to say that it's the irony of military force is that it is inherently so powerful, but counterintuitively, it is not as powerful as we would like to think at times, because the stakes are so high. And so air power can be used against nuclear states in shows of deterrence. For example, the US does a lot of flights of bombers off North Korea at times, things like that. But ultimately, air power is just another tool like any other effect. But one of its advantages is it can sometimes quickly and flexibly respond. And arguably, we can, and I'm not totally convinced of this, but we do try to use air power to communicate. Of course, what one person thinks they're communicating is not necessarily the message that is received.
Correct, correct. Thank you so much. Next question is, from an Air Force perspective, what were the key lessons learned from the Battle of Britain regarding the importance of air superiority and the role of power in defensive operations? If you can highlight some.
I'm sorry, what battle?
I'm saying, about the Battle of Britain, which happened. So, what were the, according to you, what were the key lessons which were learned, and regarding the importance of air superiority and the role of power in defensive operations?
So hugely highlights the role of command and control, and being able to, when the offense has sort of the element of surprise, being able to move your assets around quickly and respond flexibly to a situation. That's probably the conflict that highlights the importance of command and control, even though we tend to think about the exciting fighters more into success than anything else.
Thank you so much, Dr. Venable. Next question. How do you perceive the evolution of US defense, particularly its airstrike policy from the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War to the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war? Considering the defense industry is already $1 billion economy, how will AI contribute to this sector and alter the landscape of defense manufacturing?
Well, I think that in the US in particular, we have very vested and powerful interest in each of our services. And so it tends to be sort of a set, each service, the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Air Force get their own piece of pie, and it tends to stay the same. During the Cold War, the Air Force really got a lot of it, because after World War II, President Eisenhower was trying to do defense on the cheap and wanted to invest in air power for deterrence and not invest in ground power in many ways. And so it's a question of, guns versus butter. And the point of the military is to defend a nation, but the nation has a sort of a higher purpose of, its economy, which feeds and provides for its people. So it's always a balancing act between how much do you spend for military and how much do you focus on economic growth for the nation, because economic health is, of course, just as much of a empowering to a nation as its military.
Thank you so much. Next question. Could you offer a detailed analysis of the evolution of air power strategies throughout the Vietnam War, focusing on the shift from early bombing campaigns to more targeted and responsive tactics in the later stages?
Well, the Air Force early on in the war hoped to win the war quickly and decisively with air power. It believed that if it just targeted North Vietnam, I almost said North Korea because that's been more in my mind today, but if it just overwhelmed North Vietnam, a certain number of target sets, sort of economic and industrial sites, that it would force North Vietnam to stop supporting the South Vietnamese. And this, of course, represented a fundamental misunderstanding of the character of that war, with the great unhappiness of the South Vietnamese population about their government. And so there was no way that a strategic bombing campaign would have ever won the war, even if waged as US Air Force generals had wanted. There's a myth that persists in the US, especially in the US military, that civilian leadership in the White House was micromanaging the war. They were. That's completely fair. However, the myth is also that if they had just unleashed US military power, it would have turned out differently. And then they point to Linebacker 2 over the Christmas of 1972 and the early 1973, where the US did go after Hanoi really for the first time, although it tried to use precision targeting and not carpet bombing of civilians, although of course some civilians were killed. And this did bring the North Vietnamese to the bargaining table. But it was to an agreement that they had already really agreed to it, and it had just fallen apart because the US, speaking of allies and partners, wanted to make a deal with North Vietnam, and it was done with South Vietnam and did not really consider it. And so Operation Linebacker 2 resulted in a tactical victory for the US because it got the North Vietnamese back to the bargaining table, in part because the attacks overwhelmed, and the North Vietnamese typically are short-term ran out of SAMs, but it did not change the strategic outcome of the war. So how you think about Linebacker 2, whether you think it has great strategic effectiveness or not, reveals a lot about how you think about air power effectiveness.
Thank you so much. Coming to the next question. Considering the use of UAVs and kamikaze drones, could it be accurate to suggest that air power may replace or diminish the importance of ground forces in counter operations?
Yes, absolutely. And that's why I tried to show sort of different spectrums of thinking about air power. There's going to be traditional big fighters, and they still have a role. There are going to be traditional big bombers. They still have a role. But at the same time, we're seeing the democratization of air power down to the individual soldier or a platoon or a small unit. And we can only expect that to grow. And because air power has been such an expensive asset, and so it's not able to be procured in the numbers that people would like, this is a great development for armies. They can sort of do it DIY, do it yourself air power.
Yes, thank you so much. Could you also please elaborate on the technological advancements in aviation during the World War II and how and about their implications for air power, including the development of precision bombing, radar, and long-range aircraft?
Well, the US in particular really developed a theory of precision air power after World War I. However, it did not prepare very well for using it. The US envisioned fighting again against Germany and envisioned fighting against Japan. but yet it really ignored sort of common factors like weather. And so we were able to do precision with the Norden bomb sight, which ironically was invented by someone working for the U.S. Navy and not the U.S. Army Air Corps, which became the Air Force at the time. And so that seemed to work great in clear weather over the deserts of Arizona. But when you got to the cloudy skies of Europe in the winter, it did not work very great. And we ended up instead really doing a lot of horrific area bombing against German civilians. The huge development, of course, that emerged at the end of World War II, but really continued after World War II, is moving from propeller driven to sort of jet engines, and this greatly sped up the air war. However, we lost some precision and sort of loitering ability, especially in the Air Force, because the Air Force rushed into jets where, for example, Marine Corps aviation would take a different approach. They're less concerned about they're hoping that the Air Force will provide air superiority for them, for example. And so they want to invest in slower aviation that can provide more precise effects on the battlefield to support the Marines, and then also sort of hang around the battlefield longer than jets. There's always this mix, this constant battle, especially in air forces writ large that have these more responsibilities for things like air superiority. How do you blend sort of the high end survivable jets that are going to be able to do air to air combat, but also provide different effects like close air supports?
Thank you so much, Heather. Next question. How did the use of air power evolve throughout the Vietnam War? From the early bombing campaigns to the later tactics like the Operation Rolling Thunder and Linebacker 2.
So Rolling Thunder was designed to sort of ramp up air power employment as a way to communicate to North Vietnam and convince them to stop their support. And so we kind of moved up through North Vietnam in the air war. We also tried different target sets similar to what Russia is doing. We tried some oil targets, we tried some electricity targets, we tried some industrial targets, a lot of different targeting strategies in hopes of convincing the Vietnamese to stop. And this is a continual struggle for any Air Force because, textbook, you can know sort of the answer of what is most likely to work. But when, leadership wants an answer and wants results, then sometimes you end up using air power in ways that doesn't always sort of fit the textbook use. It's just the reality of how things work in war versus, how they work when you're sitting at Air University, looking at green grass and trees and hearing the birds chirp.
Yes, thank you so much. Next question. How did close air support missions in Korean War differ from strategic bombing campaigns in terms of objectives, tactics, and effectiveness?
Well, the Korean War, the US Air Force approached it in a very similar way to the Vietnam War. Coming out of World War II, the US believed that they had won by their targets on German industry, and that had been really sort of the decisive factor in the war, even though that's far too simplistic for understanding how that war was won. And so they applied the same template to North Korea. North Korea did not have much developed industry. And so we pretty much wiped out the entire country. I mean, 50 to 80% of most every city. There wasn't much left to bomb, as even Air Force generals at the time admitted. Not proud of how our country used air power in this war. And when that didn't work, when that did not stop the war, then US Air Force generals hoped to expand it into Manchuria. And they believed that then if they could just hit the logistics there, that would bring the war to an end. Again, as I said, we think that military force is so powerful, but when the stakes are so high, there's rarely ever a very easy solution to bringing a war to an end. And U.S. Air Force generals were, let's use 400 nuclear bombs against China, and that will bring the war to an end. Thankfully, that plan did not get approved. And so, meanwhile, Strategic air power was not very effective. Interdiction was also not very effective. It has been very effective in many different campaigns in history. It tends to be more effective when there's water around to make interdiction a bit easier. But when you have lots of roads and lots of railways, they can be repaired very quickly. So the interdiction, we tried lots of different approaches and it did not work very well. Close air support was used kind of like artillery. In fact, at one point of the war, the U.S. and NATO was running out of artillery, and so that was led to even more flying artillery or air power being used as artillery, which the Air Force does not like to do because it is a very expensive way to provide artillery. And then you can also see the huge contrast between sort of the high-end approach of the Air Force versus the low-end approach of the Marine Corps to close air support. Because the US was developing, the Air Force wanted top-of-the-line fighter jets for air superiority, it was less responsive in its ability to quickly provide close air support. And the Army was not happy about it and wanted more sort of Marine close air support.
Thank you so much. Next question. How extensively can air power be employed as a component of psychological warfare?
I don't know. This is a continuing question that maybe someday I should write something about it and put down my thoughts on paper because they're all sort of spread throughout my head. Air power historically can have a significant psychological effect in terms of on the battlefield and morale. When you see your own airplanes over your head and your opponent doesn't have them, that is a huge psychological advantage. So in that way, that can be a factor of psychological warfare. But on the flip side of that, to argue, I mean, I'm not arguing against the psychological effect of that, but air power isn't always necessarily best employed over the battlefield, especially if it needs to get air superiority. And so sometimes air power is working off the battlefield, and that support, even though it's not direct, the indirect support is just as important as the direct support. So it's just, I'm not arguing against myself. I'm just showing there's a flip side that sometimes psychologically the air power isn't there, but there's a reason for it. It's just obvious, understandably, soldiers would get frustrated at not understanding the bigger picture. So there's that component. Possibly, psychologically, the Ukrainian attacks on Moscow with UAVs are having a psychological effect, possibly. I'm not sure what that is. If they had, more powerful UAVs, that may have more of a psychological effect. And certainly Ukraine is trying to work towards those longer range weapons to have not only a military effect on the battlefield to sort of starve off areas, hopefully, of Russian troops, but also have more of a psychological effect. What that will be, again, we don't know, because psychologically, the default mechanism for much of air power's history was to focus on the punishment approach of civilians. And psychologically, that has not been seen to work very well. But of course, that doesn't never say never, and that doesn't mean that it would always work that way.
Thank you so much, Heather. Next question. So this is in reference to the Syrian civil war, and by also considering the US Air Force roles and also their interests. What insights can you provide into the diverse applications of air power by various parties in the Syrian civil war and their implications for regional stability?
That's a tough question. Let me think. The US, in terms of the Syrian civil war, did not want to put troops on the ground. It had already done enough of that in Afghanistan and Iraq over the last 20 years, so it really did not want to do that again. And so it tried to just use some US special forces in very small numbers with air power. And so the idea of that would be that, maybe you can do sort of less invasive operations to help with regional stability. The US, in some cases, with NATO, we saw this with Libya, wanted to help with sort of mobility and ISR more so than taking the lead in kinetic operations. And so there are different sort of combinations, but the fact of the matter is still that the US, compared to its Western allies, has huge numbers of mass, even though our mass has decreased a lot. We still have advantages in, enablers of air power, as well as sort of effect inducing air power that make it hard for us to step back when our partners ask for help. But I think that overall, in terms of regional stability, air power can have some short-term tactical and even operational benefits. But when you're talking about long-term stability, the problems that are leading to these kind of conflicts in the first place do not lend themselves to easy solutions. So air power can help, but it can't solve the underlying problems, unfortunately.
Thank you so much. Next question. How would you classify the air power that an aircraft carrier can project, and how important is it to contemporary or future wars? This is especially in the context of conflict with China in the Indo-Pacific, and or even with Iran in the Persian Gulf. So, what
Right.
impact it has?
I think that a carrier is enormously expensive. It's sort of the expression of, it's like the epitome of putting all of your eggs in one very expensive basket that can be targeted. So it could be a huge development. However, to go back to sort of my longstanding themes, just because a nation develops an offensive capability does not mean that a nation can't develop a defensive capability to protect it. And I think that the trend is going to be towards longer and longer range air power. And so it'll be a continuing back and forth between trying to reach out and hit a ship and trying to put the ship off further and still use air power to reach. And so that will require a lot of creative air mobility solutions. Instead of using expensive tankers that can be hit, trying to use more attritable tankers. And then the other thing I would say is that you never know how a weapon is going to work until it's actually used in war. And so there are some question marks about that. And certainly Russia, a lot of its wizardry weapons were found to not work as well as promised. However, to go back to the psychological question, air power has a deterrent effect. Raving about how awesome your weapons are sometimes can have a deterrent psychological effect. It's just sometimes you're found out in war that you don't have the weapons that you said you did. So it remains to be seen. Just because Russia's wizardful weapons did not work out as well as expected does not mean that China's will not work as advertised.
Thank you so much, Dr. Heather P. Venable, for being here today at the Tillotoma Foundation and for sharing your great analysis and insights on today's theme, fundamentals of the air power strategy. It was an excellent session which provided us with a deeper understanding of the following: the principles and key components involved in formulating an effective air power strategy. You also mentioned a lot about Russia-Ukraine war, the fundamentals to achieving success in modern warfare, and the importance of leveraging air power as a means of military power beyond direct engagement with enemy forces or their means of support. I look forward to seeing you again soon with another topic, interesting topic of discussion and our continued collaboration. Thank you once again. A very good morning there. Hope you have a great day. And yes, here in India, I hope everyone have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you.